Hello, Garland Nixon here with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, who has a PhD in American history from Brandeis University, and he is the editor for CovertActionMagazine.com. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov, and might I add, he's got a great site. And I mean, this is a website. If you haven't been going here, it's one of my favorites. It's one of the ones that I learned the most from, and it is Covert Action Magazine. Just go to CovertActionMagazine.com. All kinds of awesome articles. Look at this. Syria's genocide claiming over blah blah blah. Deliberate Western strategy to dominate the entire region. How about that? uh, Under the bright poppy fields of a valley of darkness, right? How about here? Western imperialism, all kinds of stuff. U.S. backed regime change. Who will be the next president of Ukraine? I mean, all kinds of awesome stuff here. It is a fantastic website with a lot of actually. You got covert videos there. You got various series, whether it's JFK, whatever you wanted to know about covert action and a spy uh, um, goings on. Covert Action magazines where you want to go. All right, let's go here. The U.S.-Israel alliance has sowed disaster for Israel. And what's interesting about this is I have so many friends that we always have this conversation, Jeremy, and that is, does Israel run the U.S.? Does the U.S. run Israel? And the first person I had is, as many people know, my political mentor for years was Paul Robeson Jr. And he's the first person that enlightened me. I asked him about that. He said, Garland Nixon, Israel is an imperial military and intelligence outpost for the U.S. empire. He says, I don't consider it a country. I consider it Fort Israel. It may have its implications. They got things they want to do. They got their Zionist plans. But as far as the U.S. empire is concerned, it is a military and intelligence outpost in the region of the world where all the oil is. Don't get it mixed up. He talked about the AIPAC, and he's like, yeah, AIPAC money doesn't come from Israel. It's Zionist right here and people here who are putting the money into AIPAC. Most of the time, it's American money, and it's going towards Fort Israel. Anyway, so let's start here. The U.S.-Israel alliance has sowed disaster for Israel. Without U.S. support, Israel's leaders could have been compelled to seek a just resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict instead of pursuing a greater Israel. Your thoughts on the comments I just made, and let's go from there.
Yeah, I would agree with Paul Robeson Jr. I think Israel, and this is something I do discuss a bit in the article, that they are indeed an outpost of the U.S. empire. And I mean, and I've done previous article that discuss the military bases that aren't so secret anymore. At one point, they were these secret military bases that the United States has in the Negev desert, and the intelligence collaboration between the two countries, how the United States had developed Israel military technology and then used a lot of that technology. Israel was the forefront in drone development. So, I mean, this benefits American interest. And in this article, I discuss how Israel over the years has done a lot of the dirty work of the U.S. empire, functioning as U.S. regional proxy, including in the Six-Day War, 1967. The CIA had tried to assassinate Nasser and orchestrated a coup. They sent in Kermit Roosevelt, who had orchestrated the coup in Iran in '53 to get rid of Nasser, who was a bête noire of the American empire because he was a pan-Arabist who wanted to nationalize the oil and place it under the control of Egyptians and Middle Eastern people, and to unify the Arab countries under socialism to undercut Western empires. So that was a no-no for U.S. foreign policy makers. So they used Israel. They failed to overthrow Nasser, but then they used Israel. They armed it to the teeth. Israel provoked a war with Egypt and then humiliated Nasser and his armies in the Six-Day War. and took over parts of Egypt because Gaza had been part of Egypt. So that was a major coup for U.S. foreign policy. And then, now they use Israel to attack Iran. I mean, it was, the U.S., don't forget, was the one who hates Iran because they overthrew a client of the United States, the Shah, and they established the sovereignty of the Iranian nation uh, from its neo-colonial status under the Shah. And the U.S. wants to control the entire Middle East and doesn't want any rivals to its power, and Iran a potential rival. So they play up, the human rights abuses, but they've gone after that regime. But they use Israel, and Israel's assassinated Iranian scientists, and the one leading the way against Iran and proxied like Hezbollah. So Israel is doing U.S. bidding. Yeah, there had been, I discussed in a previous article that there had been some debate in the U.S. elite about this going back to the 40s. Actually, Kermit Roosevelt and James Forrestal worried about the U.S. Allying with Israel too much and using as a proxy that would alienate the other Arab countries, turn them against the United States, and the United States would not have the same opportunities to exploit the oil resources of those Arab countries. But Forrestal died under very suspicious circumstance and looked like he was murdered. He was the first Secretary of Defense who adopted a more or less anti-Zionist policy. And Kermit Roosevelt was kind of just marginalized and given a position at the Gulf Oil. But they had Kermit Roosevelt and some people around him in the CIA had funded an anti-Zionist lobby group in the United States. However, yeah, he lost out. By the time of the Kennedy administration, Kennedy was actually a key president in consolidating because Eisenhower had somewhat more balanced approach toward Israel and Middle East, and didn't stand by Israel. During the Suez Crisis, he actually threatened Israel with sanctions, but Kennedy really consolidated the U.S. unfettered support for Israel and supply of arms to Israel, and that extended more and later presidents. So, yeah, I fully agree with what Paul Robeson Jr. said, and I don't think the too much is made of the AIPAC. I do believe they are influential, but they wouldn't succeed unless there were a deeper purpose in using Israel for U.S. foreign policy. And that's true for other lobbies that were influential, like the China lobby. I mean, sure, they were influential in the 40s and 50s, but ultimately the U.S. Government, didn't want a communist government in China, and they wanted an open market in China for American investors. So the China lobby was able to succeed in getting a huge amount of money for the nationalist forces in China, and then when they fled to Taiwan. So it's somewhat similar, I think.
It seems to be like the same kind of dynamic as controlled opposition. You know what I mean? You create this opposition, and then the opposition's forcing me to do this or forcing me to do that, right? When you control them, you just want the illusion that you're being dragged into doing something you don't want to do, right? I recall recently, and I bring this up, to me it's very illuminating, where the Israelis had bombed a hospital or did some horrible thing, and the world was like, "Oh, this is terrible." And the United States, the Biden administration went, "Oh, yeah, that's not good." And then some people, I forgot which one it was, but in the because the U.S. joined, "Oh, that's terrible. Israel shouldn't have done that." And some of the leaders of the Israeli government came forward and said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! Tony Blinken sat in on the meeting when we decided to do that and approved all of the targeting." And all of a sudden, the Biden administration went, "Oh, you know what? Uh-oh, you weren't supposed to know that." And that led me to believe that's always the case. That when people go, "Oh my God, I can't believe Israel did that," and the U.S. is like, "Well, that they're sitting in there with Israel. They're doing the targeting. They're helping the target. Well, do you think you should use this missile or that missile? Well, go ahead. We got tents there. We can kill lots of people if we bomb them. Then Israel does it. And the U.S. is like, well, I guess they really shouldn't do it, but we're trying to stop them. That they're like a cat's paw. Anyway, your thoughts?
Well, that would illustrate Paul Robeson Jr.'s point that this is really an extension of the U.S. government, and the U.S. government is actually planning their military operations uh, and is providing the financial resources for them to carry it out. And one of my points in the article is that this is ultimately a disaster for Israel and Jewish people, that they prostituted themselves to the American imperial interests. Because if you look, I mean, Israeli politics used to have a lot of debate, and there were strong factions that favored accommodation with the Palestinians and cooperation, coexistence. And a lot of the original Zionists, I mean, the Jewish people had a history of being persecuted and treated badly, and could identify with minority groups that were oppressed because they were one of them. And a lot of the original Zionists were socialists. So, I mean, there was the potential that the Zionist project could have worked out in the sense that there wouldn't be these endless warfare. But by prostituting themselves to the United States and its interests, they pushed for more aggressive policy toward the Palestinian and toward its neighbors and trying to forge a greater Israel. And in turn, they've compromised the security of the Jewish nation state and the well-being not only of the Palestinian and Arab, but also of the Jewish people. Because now and I'm Jewish, and a lot of us are ashamed to be identified with those horrific conduct and those horrific leaders. And it really doesn't represent the values we grew up in or we learned from the religion. So that in itself is a disgrace. And I mean, Israel's economy has contracted a lot since the Gaza war. There's no tourism. I mean, it's becoming an international pariah state. So is this good for Israelis and Jews? And look at the history. Countries that have aligned with the United States face their own destruction. I mean, look at Ukraine is another good example. That country had been the worst decision ever to ally and basically sold itself out to the United States as a base to attack Russia and destabilize and weaken Russia. So the U.S. could dominate Eurasia and its oil resources, just like the Middle East. And where that led Ukraine today, the loss of a generation of its youth, a loss of a lot of its land, the selling off of its economy and land to Wall Street banks, and the country's in absolutely horrific shape, and Israel's in increasingly worse shape. 200. The book I was reviewing is an excellent book. I would recommend to listeners, called "The Fall of Israel" by Steinbach, and it's with Clarity Press. And he has a lot of statistics just on bad living condition in Israel. And he presents a statistic that 200,000 Jews have had to flee. And I've met a number of them in my city. It's not safe for them to live in Israel, and it's not a good environment. It's a highly oppressive state. I mean, our political culture is pretty toxic here too, but it's absolutely toxic political culture. And certain industries are being devastated. Like tourism was one mainstay of the Israeli economy, and people aren't going. The tourist industry has suffered tremendously since October 7th. So, Israel is suffering and could suffer more. The Israeli people could see a precipitous decline in their living standard, and they're already in the position of being a pariah state. And who wants that? I mean, everywhere you go, you're kind of suspect. You say, I'm from Israel, and everyone will just look at you. You're the ones who committed this butchery in Gaza, and you have these maniacs as your leaders. It's not a good look.
Well,
Yeah.
and let me add this, I think, and this is important. And I've said this, I think the current iteration of Zionism and the use of it by the US is one of the worst possible things. It's like ironic that they say, okay, this is to protect Jews. Since the October 7th and the response of October 7th of violence and genocide, I've never seen so much anti-Semitism outright in my life online, right? A combination of things. People basically saying things like, well, the Biden administration, you had a lot of Jewish people saying, well, look at these Jews are destroying our country by leading our country down to, Zionism and Israel and all this stuff, right? Then hating Israel and being legitimately angry at the country and at Israel, but interpret into Jews, Jews, Jews. What ironically has happened as a result of a heavy Zionist project, because I would bring up, well, yeah, you can say that the Biden administration has a lot of Jewish Zionists, but Joe Biden's not Jewish and he's a Zionist. You know what I mean? You can just say they got a bunch of Zionists. It doesn't matter, because Zionism it's an ideology. It's not a religion, right? But my point being, it has generated anti-Semitism that I see online, sometimes in the chat and stuff like that. Anti-Semitism that I did not see before, and anger rather than saying, I don't like Zionism and I don't like what the country of Israel is doing, or I don't like our government's policies. People get angry. Oh, all the Jews are, how people tend to do, just say, oh, the whole group is bad. Oh, all Jews are bad. So the great irony is not just Israel has been devastating for. I think it's been terrible for Jewish people worldwide. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's one of my points in this article, and I think a visionary and somewhat a prophet of the Jewish tradition was Noam Chomsky, he's still alive, but I know he's very ill. I think he had a stroke and he's not able to speak out publicly anymore. But his writing were very prescient, for years. And I think he was attacked as a self-hating Jew, but in fact, if you read his works carefully, he's actually writing from somebody who's kind of an anguished Jew who was, and if you look at his background, he had a background in the Zionist movement. His father was, I think, heavily involved with it, and was also a linguist like him in the Hebrew languages. And I know Noam went to Israel and lived on a kibbutz as a young man in the late 40s. And he grew disillusioned then because he saw certain racism among Israeli toward the Palestinians. But he was not hostile toward the Zionist ideal. He did support a binational state for a long time of coexistence between Jews and Jewish settlers and Palestinians. But he was warning for a long time that these aggressive policies, and he chronicled the takeover of the Israeli state by right-wing extremists and a growing authoritarian feature within Israel, as well as the horrific nature of the occupation of Palestinian lands and the whitewashing of the history of the foundation of the state of Israel and Nakba. And that was one of his arguments, that this was, the same argument both of us, I think, are in agreement that this is not good for the Jewish people. And yeah, one consequence, and it's destroy. He said it would destroy the state of Israel and destroy ultimately, have terrible consequences for the Jewish people, and that's starting to play out today. And yeah, it inflames people. Yeah, unfortunately, some people may not be that well informed, and they see something horrible going on there. So yeah, their instinct is to blame all the Jews, and it's bringing out this latent anti-Semitism. So that can be seen as another negative consequence of all this. And unfortunately, the left and more peace-oriented voices have just been crushed in Israel. So there doesn't seem to be any hope for the reorientation of Israeli foreign policy and the more authoritarian nature of that state today.
Yeah, it's a nature of people to blame entire groups, and for the U.S., it's nothing's better than to do the evil deed and then not take the, what is it? There's a saying in the Latin culture that says you throw the rock and hide your hand. You know what I mean? You do the
Yeah,
deed and then you pretend like you didn't do it, and
yeah,
that seems to me that Israel and Ukraine both are very, very effective tools for throwing the rock and hiding the hand. The problem is when you get out of the way and say they did it, everybody gets angry at them. And so, and I
Yeah.
think that that it gets back to the spirit of your article, which is Israel is actually being used. Israel is far worse off in its circumstances, and the U.S. Well, let's just go here. The least popular leader in the history of Israel right now is Netanyahu, and the U.S. has been keeping him in power, even though the people of Israel will be like, hey, he's corrupt, or they're holding up signs and they hate him and all that kind of stuff for whatever reason. But the U.S. keeps the least popular person, a guy who has been wrapped his entire life, has been wrapped in allegations of corruption, which you touch into here, I might add. Talk about your thoughts on that.
Okay, well, and yeah, on your first point, yeah, I think that's a good point. That then, when it's clear to everyone that things have gone sour in this relationship, they kind of scapegoat and blame the other group and throw them under the bus. So they never take any responsibility when it's the United States who's orchestrating these brutal policies to extend its imperial domination. And now, yeah, they're totally deflecting any blame, and maybe they'll sell Netanyahu on the bus ultimately and allow him to be taken in by the international court, but they'll never take any responsibility. I mean, ultimately, as you were saying, Blinken was calling the shot that the U.S. arms. If Netanyahu go down, the American leaders should go down too, but they would never allow that. And perhaps there are some elements who want to play up the AIPAC so they can blame this hidden force in American politics, and that turns people away from looking at the corporate oligarchy in the United States and how they drive this imperialistic foreign policy that results in endless wars around the globe, because it's the oil company and the Wall Street banks that want to control the oil, profit from that. So they're the ones who orchestrated this strategy. They removed Forrestal and Kermit Roosevelt, who within that elite were the ones to question it on their own terms. They got rid of those people so they can go forward. And it's them driving all this and all the violence. And it's the same in Ukraine. They created the conflict deliberately to try and weaken the Russians, and now they want to seize the Ukrainian minerals as well. But by blaming AIPAC, you're diverting people from the real cancer, and that is the corporate financial oligarchy that needs to be overthrown, and a genuine democracy need to be set up in the United States, where a decent and more humane foreign policy could be enacted. If you just blame AIPAC, then your solution is to go after AIPAC and the Jews, but that won't change the nature of foreign policy. Yeah, and it could lead to some ugly consequences for Jewish people. So I agree with your assessment. And on the point of Netanyahu, yeah, there have been huge revolt. I mean, the Israeli politics, like kind of our politics, just shifted so far to the right. And I mean, these right-wing policies, like we're seeing in the United States, are terrible for most of the population. I mean, it fuels huge inequality, like what Trump is doing. I mean, although I do agree that there is the need for some reforms of government agencies, and there is some waste and a need for auditing. But the way Trump is doing it, and his agenda is just a right-wing agenda to empower the billionaire classes, to cut taxes on them, to redirect any government focus basically on supporting them, and cutting program for the majority, and cutting taxes on corporations and the wealthy, and cutting government programs that would be funded by those taxes. And that's the same course that has been pursued, and it's been pursued in this country. Trump is just taking it to a more extreme level from what's been going on for the last 30 to 35 years. And Israel has followed the same course, because Israel had, was founded by many socialists. The kibbutz ideal is rooted in socialism and egalitarianism. The Labor Party had been very strong and dominant in Israeli politics. There had been even more left-wing parties that had a strong influence in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and into the 70s in Israel. but those have been destroyed. They had their own J. Edgar Hoover type figure named Isser Harrell, and the left wing faced a lot of persecution, and they altered the political culture. And I think American support was key to that. And so Netanyahu was adopting an extreme right wing agenda that empowered the billionaire classes, and Israel became, like the United States, ever more a two-tiered class society with a hollowing out middle class, rising cost of living, and that generated mass protests, especially when he tried to assert more power for the presidency. And Israel was gripped by huge protests on the eve of October 7th, and that's why it's not hard to imagine that as a false flag operation, because Netanyahu needed a war to try and keep him in power, and he needed something spectacular. And the Steinbach book goes into that. And I mean, they knew that this is not even controversial at all. It's been openly reported and acknowledged that they knew weeks in advance that Hamas was planning an attack. And I mean, Israel's soldiers said that attack could have been stopped within minutes, if not seconds, because of the heavily censored border wall. And amazingly, there was no reaction for hours and hours. And then, Israeli troops didn't even defend their own communities when Hamas came in. And of course, we know that a lot of people killed were killed by the Israeli military under the Hannibal Directive. And then there were the question mark of these cars that were destroyed at the Tribe of Nova Music Festival. And there were Apache helicopter attacks. Well, Hamas doesn't have Apache helicopters. So who destroyed those cars and committed a lot of the violence at that rock festival? If it came from an Apache helicopter, it had to have been the Israelis. So you don't have to be, well, of course, they call me conspiracy theory for saying that in the mainstream media, but really it's just common sense. If you have any common sense, you would understand how they could have stopped those attacks. And this was a setup because Netanyahu was going to fall from power and he was going to prison. And there have been allegations against him since the late 90s. This is a very corrupt, unprincipled mafia type guy. And he should have been in jail a long time ago. And it shows, it gets at the Steinbach point of the degradation of Israeli politics. And this is supposed to be some kind of model democracy, which obviously it is not.
Well, there's so many 9/11 comparisons there, wherein there was even discussions of what was named 9/11. Oh, we need a Pearl Harbor type incident, and then 9/11 hits, and then they all seem, everybody knows all the dancing Israelis and all that kind of stuff. So the connections to 9/11 lead one to believe that the Israelis would not be, it wouldn't be shocking to find out. Now, apparently, it was reported that the Egyptians and others had notified the Israelis that something, might be afoot. And then this happens. And to me, as you said, to me, the key is there had been massive protests going on for months. And add this, Israel was on like its third government in 18 months. It had become politically unstable to the point where I started saying, I don't know what the future is for Israel, because it goes through government after government falls. It's become politically unstable. Now the Netanyahu government looks like it's ready to fall. It's completely political. Boom, what do you know? Oh, October 7th, war. We got to all come together. You know what I mean? And I'm like, well, that's awful suspicious, because clearly the three governments, I think it was 18, wasn't it like 18 months where they had different governments leading up to that?
Mm-hmm.
So basically, we had an unstable country stabilize around war. And immediately, to me, the other key was the U.S. completely supported this in every way, shape, or form. And so I think talk about one of I didn't realize this. I had somebody tell me that was very familiar with what's going on in Israel. One of the things that the Israelis have been doing is to even pretend that they have an economy. A lot of Israelis are in Cyprus. A lot of them, there are other places they've left because of the what's going, that. And if someone in Cyprus or elsewhere uses an ATM card, but it's connected to their bank or their home, whatever, in Israel, right? Israel counts that as part of, spending going on in their economy, even though the person spending it in another country, that they're cooking the books that actually Israel's economy is far worse than even the numbers that they have now, and that it's being just floated by the US, which, of course, as you said, if you have a country that's completely economically floated by the US empire, you don't have a country, and B, you can't say no to them about it, about anything.
Yeah, and this is not the ideal of Zionism came, in the face of the persecution that Jews faced, the pogroms. My family experienced that in Russia, the Dreyfus affair in France. But this is not a good haven for the Jew that is constantly attacking its neighbors with U.S. weapons, and it just sold itself out to the dominant imperialistic power of the day. And as a result, it's involved in the grossest injustices and crimes of our lifetime. Uh, and it's a horror show. And that's why you had the Chomskys, and there were people before, people like Albert Einstein were very worried back in the 40s about the direction that the Zionist movement and Israeli government was taking, even after its formation. So, it's a sorry situation, and it showed the nature of U.S. power, that they use others to do their dirty work, and it's really dirty. I mean, controlling the oil. The whole goal is to dominate the Middle East and control its oil resources, and they have to carry out genocidal campaigns to try and achieve that. And look at Syria. The U.S. foreign policy elite considered that a great success. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal after, in late December, after Al Qaeda came in, and they were gushing. They're like, "Oh, this showed the great success of all of our policies." And because Syria was back, the Assad government was supported by Iran, and it was used as a conduit for support for Hezbollah. So they're like, "We've cut off this head of the snake, and all our policies are good, are shown to be right now." And I mean, their total disregard for the human costs of these policies. And in that case, it unleashed Al Qaeda on Syria, who've been carrying out waves of ethnic cleansing against the Shiite Alawite population, if not outright genocide. Some are calling it genocide. I read some report that in a 3-week period, 50,000 people were killed. I don't know if that number is accurate, but clearly something horrible is going on there. And the Israelis are just expanding their occupation. They're using the weakening of this and hollowing out of the Syrian government to expand their military presence and occupation of Syria and attempt to loot the resources of Syria. It just showed the bankruptcy. These kind of imperialistic foreign policies lead to absolute catastrophe for local population and destruction of societies. And the sanctions imposed on Syria were absolutely devastating to the Syrian population in the face of their civil war, and caused biblical scale humanitarian catastrophe, with a huge percent of the population living now in poverty and a lack of electricity. And their oil has been stolen from them. The U.S. placed its troops strategically in northern Syria, right near the oil, so they can steal the oil and allow U.S. companies to exploit it and ruin the local economy. So, I mean, you have to ask the question: what does it mean to be a human being? Were we put on this earth, the neoconservatives, to torture and starve other people and inflict unimaginable suffering, so you can live the high life? Is that our purpose as human beings? I mean, I try and personally, it's not. If I'm living great and I know my actions have caused people to live in abject misery and have unleashed a genocidal violence, I'm not, going to be comfortable with myself. But I guess these neoconservatives live in a different planet from me. They don't have any problem with all this.
Yeah. Well, let's go now to another article that you have, and it is, when will the AFL-CIO leadership finally repudiate its dark Cold War history and pact with the CIA? Right. And it's interesting because a lot of people don't know about that. You know, the CIA had connections to, I mean, intelligence, major connections to the mafia. And of course, whether it was well, I'll put it like this: the mafia had major connections to the various trade unions, and you wonder whether it's the mafia having connection with the trade unions or the intelligence agencies wanting them in there. We do know, at least in the instance of Lucky Luciano, the naval intelligence got Lucky Luciano, literally got him out of jail so he could run the unions on the waterfront in World War II in what they said was needed to deal with German spies. So, you know, the nexus is there. But let's talk about your article.
Great, yeah, and this is largely unknown history in the United States, and in the face of what I was describing earlier with the Trump cutting the government and the complete right wing dominance in American politics and the hollowing out of the middle and working class, I think the only hope is the revitalization of the American labor movement. And I think it's important to go back and look at some of the history and how that movement got compromised during the Cold War, and not to repeat that pattern, because that ultimately emboldened corporate interest. The weakening and co-optation of the labor movement was crucial to the financial oligarchy, consolidating its power in the United States, and the right-wing shift in the direction of American policy. So this is, kind of cautionary lesson for the labor movement, and shows also how imperialism operates, how they use these civic society or grassroots organizations and corrupt them and use them to manipulate political developments in foreign countries. And example, like, 'cause the AFL-CIO, set up these umbrella organizations that would penetrate foreign labor unions to muscle out the leftists and the communists. And in some cases, if there was a socialist government like Chile, they would pay them off to create strikes and havoc in the country to destabilize the government and create a situation of crisis that was a precondition for a coup, and it had disastrous consequence in Chile with the fascist coup. That Kissinger was a key figure behind that, and the CIA, and it brought in fascism to Chile, and thousands of people were tortured and killed, like is going on in Syria now. They were brought to a soccer stadium and massacred. Even the Bob Dylan of Chile, Victor Yara, was murdered by these fascists. And they also ruined Chile's economy. They adopted a pro-corporation policy that led to this kind of two-tiered class structure that we were discussing in Israel and the United States. So these kind of policies are disastrous for foreign countries. And Chile had been moving in a very progressive direction in the 60s, and then when Allende took over, he was placing their copper industry under national control, and that's why he was targeted for regime change. And yeah, they did that. These affiliates, like, it started in Europe under the Marshall Plan. They were very active in co-opting the European labor movement, and that's when they used the mafia. They were like, communists were very influential in the European, like in France and Italy, their labor movements in the 40s after World War II, and there were a lot of strikes. And these CIA offshoots would infiltrate those labor groups, and they used the mafia to beat up and attack the leftists. And one guy bragged how he threw so many into the port of Versailles, and who knows how many they killed. So they used the mafia to muscle out the leftists, take control over the European labor movement, and and moderate its tactics and get it to help empower the center left. In the case of Europe, after World War II, they were aiming to install center-left governments that were anti-communist and anti-Soviet. Um, so, so there's a long, dark history. Another country. I think the book I reviewed discussed, and I've done research on, was like Guyana. They used the labor. They stirred up strikes to undermine Cheddi Jagan, who was like Allende, who was more of a socialist leader. And they fomented a race war because Cheddi Jagan was an Indian. Guyana had been a British colony, and they had Indians and Afro-Guyanese. And Jagan, was trying to unify the Indians and Afro-Guyanese along class lines and adopt a more progressive socialistic economic program. And so the CIA went in there and through working through the labor unions, just stirred up unrest and played up racial conflict instead of bringing them together, played up racial conflict and stirred the Afro-Guyanese against the Indians. And it ultimately resulted in the overthrow of Cheddi Jagan and empowerment of Forbes Burnham, who was a corrupt dictator who stole all the country's wealth for himself and his cronies. So the country remained underdeveloped. So a lot of these policies, contributed to long-term poverty and underdevelopment, as well as things like fascist coups and involved use of the mafia. It's pretty dirty stuff when you get down into it. So, I mean, the AFL-CIO should repudiate that history, and if it wants to it should make a clean break from that past if it wants to be a revitalized force today in American life and around the world.
Well, look, the JFK assassination, as soon as you find out that the so-called shooter had been in Mexico City, had been in Cuba, he'd been in South America near the CIA, as soon as you find out that the guy that kills Oswald is mafia, I mean, these are so classic. As soon as you find out those few little details that Oswald has traveled and where the CIA does their mafia, their South American dirt, and then and then you bring the mafia into it. It's like, well, that is so obviously a CIA operation that and that's what um, when people talk about the mafia involved in unions, my thought was always that's the CIA's in for the union. You know what I mean? The CIA wants the mafia involved in unions because that's a way for the CIA to get involved in the unions without people suspecting it's the CIA. They can just say, well, it's the mafia, it's organized crime. That's, again, to me, in many instances, the mafia is a cat's paw for intelligence.
Well, yeah, in this book, I think the author, Jeff Shirky, it's called Labor's Empire. It's another excellent book that sheds light on this. And Alfred McCoy was a distinguished historian who wrote a great book years ago now called The Politics of Heroin, CIA Complicity in the Global Drug Trade. And that was an eye-opener to me because I read that as a graduate student when I was still pretty naive. And he really had a lot of good evidence about the CIA's work with the mafia, like what I was describing in Europe, and then he went into Southeast Asian drug trade and the CIA's alliance with the mafia there, whether the Corsican mafia or these local Asian warlords who were mafia linked, who controlled the drug trade, and that was being used to finance, CIA covert operations. And in South Vietnam, they put into power after the Diem coup, Nguyen Cao Ki, who had been a mafia don and was a big drug smuggler and Hitler admirer, and that's who the CIA's boy and who the CIA helped install as South Vietnam's leader. So there is a fairly rich history, and if you read some of these books, it's really spelled out in detail this coterminous relationship between the CIA and mafia. And of course, the Castro assassination plots were all exposed. The Church Committee hearing, how they used the mafia. And this goes on, today. I mean, you can look at a conflict like Ukraine, and the U.S. and CIA are really allied with mafia warlord elements like Ihor Kolomoisky, with a financial backer of Zelensky, and a governor who is raising revenue for these militias and adjuncts of the Ukrainian army, like the Azov battalion. And he is a mafia-linked figure. I think he's now under indictment. Ultimately they may sell them under the bus because he can't come to the United States. I believe he has a lot of indictments in the United States if he ever comes here. But he was very tight with Zelensky, and he was connected with this company Burisma that had Hunter Biden and Cofer Black, the CIA #3, on its board. So if you get into that, you see how these liaisons are carried out. And I would add, corporation to the mix. They're also linked with the mafia and intelligence, the most prosperous corporations.
Well, how about this? When HSBC Bank got in trouble for laundering money for warlords, for drug lords, HSBC got in trouble, and they went out and they hired James Comey to negotiate. They brought James Comey in, and he negotiated with the government a settlement. And they said, "Okay, pay this amount as long as you never do it again." They did it again within like a year. Here's a perfect example of what we're talking about here. How HSBC laundered millions for Mexican drug lords. In 2000, the bank paid 1.9 for its part in helping Sinaloa, El Chapo cartel to launder the money. Why has no one taken the whatever it is? Right? There we go. So the bottom line, I have heard it said that it is believed that of these big, particularly the European banks, that up to 30% of their money is laundering from cartels. Laundering. We know that there was a guy, I forgot his name, but he had a bank. I think it was called like the Republican Bank of New York. That was just nothing but a black ops bank for the CIA operations. And then when Russia fell, he was literally flying plane loads of cash into Russia when the Soviet Union fell, so they could buy up all of the government, entities at for pennies on the dollar. So the CIA was involved in all of that, but most people don't understand that these major banks, HSBC, these huge banks that you see, most of them are, to an extent, you can make the argument that they're criminal operations.
Yeah, I found that in some of my research. Like I have an article I may publish in the future on the Nugent Hand Bank, was a pure CIA money laundering operation with the mafia for the drug trade out of Indochina. And it was set up in the late 70s, early 80s. And then that was, there are numerous offshoots of that bank. And there was also the BCCI, Bank of Credit and Commerce International. And that's how Iran-Contra, was carried out through some of those money laundering banks. And then in the Arkansas, these are just cases I've studied. I mean, I agree with everything you say. I'm not an expert on banking, but I have studied a few cases like Nugent Hand, and I also studied Clinton's Arkansas. And there were a lot of banks set up, and a lot of the owners was the Stevens investment house, which is the largest investment house outside of Wall Street. Jack Stevens, and he was a top Clinton donor, and his lawyer was Hillary Clinton and the Rose Law Firm, and he owned all these banks around Arkansas, and they were laundering money from the MENA operation, which was a drug arms smuggling operation, to the Nicaraguan Contras after Congress, banned aid to the Contras, and it was being laundered in banks across Arkansas under Clinton's watch. Owned these banks, a lot owned by Clinton's top donor, Jackson Stevens. So that's a direct case of money laundering, corruption, and it goes on and on. And
yeah, it's in fact. Do I see the book? I've got a book that was. Here we go. It was written by someone who went to your to Brandeis, and it's called, I don't know if you can see it, Presidential Puppetry. and it is by Andrew Craig, and he
Oh yeah.
goes into a number of presidents, and he basically shows what Clinton being one of them, Obama being another one, with Obama's mother being CIA, and he shows the connections between a number of presidents, and says, but here, before they became presidents, their families or these presidents had long connections to the CIA, which, he basically says, look, it's Obama, Romney, and their masters. But so he brings up that these so-called powerful political persons in US politics, when you look at their history, these are actual, documented connections that they have to intelligence, enough that it could cause one to conclude that even their presidency was either um, intelligence operations, or that they were so compromised by intelligence that their presidency was effectively puppetry, because they could have been taken down at any time by the intelligence operatives.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I mean, I've studied a number of presidencies, and the ones I found strong connection to the CIA. Well, obviously George H.W. Bush, who'd been a CIA director
Yeah,
and
can't
set
get
up
any
the
closer than
CIA,
that.
yeah, CIA company with a Bay of Pigs in the '60s. Then you have Bill Clinton, who, according to Cordmeyer Jr., was recruited by the CIA while a student at Oxford, and his roommate Strobe Talbot had strong connect, came from a CIA family, and they went on a mission as students into Russia to smuggle out the memoirs of Nikita Khrushchev, which was valuable to the CIA because Khrushchev had denounced Stalin, and that could be used as a weapon against the Soviet Union. And Clinton never actually graduated from Oxford. He got accused of sexual harassment, surprise, surprise, of female students. And then the report on him said he was there to party, network, and womanize, not to study. But they protected him, and then he went to Yale, and then he did a big service to the CIA with the whole Mina operation I was describing, to smuggle arms out of the state of Arkansas to the Contras. So they rewarded him. And then Obama, yeah, his family is linked to the CIA through his grandfather, who facilitated these exchanges that brought African students who were being groomed by the State Department or CIA at the University of Hawaii East West Center, which is like a Pacific branch of the School of the Americas, to groom and train Army officers in Southeast Asia. And then his mother was trained in the Russian language and sent to Indonesia to work undercover, promoting microfinance loans for the Ford Foundation. But she was sent to a province that was a hotbed of leftist and communist activity, and she was well positioned to gain, political information on the people she was helping provide loans for, and is suspected of being part of an operation ProSims that was tied to the death squad being run. It was like a Phoenix project for Indonesia that the CIA helped coordinate, where they were eliminating leftists, either jailing, torturing, or murdering them. And then he went to Pakistan in the 80s with his former stepfather, who had been a liaison between the Indonesian army and oil companies in Indonesia. And he was on some unauthorized mission into Pakistan during the time of the Mujahideen, where the CIA was arming the Mujahideen. Then he worked for a CIA front company after college. Of course, they created the illusion that he was a community organizer, but his first job after college was for a Business International Corporation, which studied the investment climate in foreign countries and with an intelligence front. And then even the community, his work as a community organizer was one of these big corporate foundations that also get money from the CIA. And their allegations, I mean, I don't know if they're true, but that he was there to infiltrate radical black groups and foment divisions, and serve as a spy, which may or may not be true, but that is an allegation. So anyway, those two, if you look at their background, they have strong intelligent connection. And then look at their presidencies. For Obama, Leon Panetta, who, by the way, gave a speech at the last Democratic convention, which is DCIA. Panetta said Obama gave us everything we wanted. And, Panetta gave, when he was president, and Panetta gave a speech at this Democratic convention praising Ronald Reagan and attacking Trump because he visited with Putin. So that's
Well,
what happened
how about
when
this?
the CIA
After
took over a party.
How about this? After Trump's last, kind of faux State of the Union speech, right? The woman, I think her name might have been Elizabeth Slotkin. I'm not sure.
Oh,
She
yeah,
was,
she has a CIA background, yeah.
yes, okay. She was the person that the Democrats chose to give the rebuttal to Trump's speech. And in her rebuttal, she praised Reagan, basically saying, that Reagan knows how to knew how to deal with the Russians. So Panetta, all of these people. Now, why are they so happy with Reagan's bloody reign of terror? Because his vice president was a CIA operative, was the former chief of the CIA. Because literally, this, as you've written about, the CIA did an illegal undercover operation with the Iranian hostages to make sure that Reagan won. And then Reagan comes in and he brings in a former CIA. So it makes sense that the intelligence agencies would always promote Ronald Reagan as the top president of all time, ignoring all of the massacres and genocides and horrible, bloody things that he did in Latin America. No, he's the great guy that destroyed communism. He's good. Oh, by the way, he had a CIA operative as his vice president, who then became president.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And also, Reagan collaborated with the FBI during the McCarthy era against the Hollywood 10. He collaborated to identify supposed leftists and ex-communists in Hollywood. So he cooperated with intelligence agencies going back to the early 50s.
So he
And then he
clearly,
attacked the radical at Berkeley, who the CIA and FBI infiltrated and tried to destroy that movement of young people. And Reagan attacked that movement and even cooperated. There's a book I have that's very good by an investigative journalist who I think had been the editor of the Berkeley Barb. And he got all this documents. His name is Seth Rosenfield. And he showed how Reagan worked with the FBI, even to undermine the president, foreshadow what's going on now under Trump. Clark Kerr was the president of Berkeley, and actually the students hated him because he attacked the Berkeley free speech movement. But Reagan and I guess the intelligence agencies viewed him as too soft on the protesters still and too liberal. And this book shows how Reagan, when he was the governor, worked with the FBI to have Kerr removed from his post and to put in an even more hardline guy.
well, one could then suspect that he became governor, that it was no accident that he became governor of California. And I always bring this up about Obama. Obama was just a local state senator, and all of a sudden in '84 they bring him in to give the speech at the DNC, and everybody's like,
Yeah.
"Oh, Obama!" everywhere, and everything written is Obama's the next president. He's great. He's wonderful. Then he decides to run for Senate, and if you remember what happened, he ran for Senate, and everybody's like, "Well, there's an incumbent. He's probably not going to win." And the guy that he was running against suddenly got, oh, what a shock, engulfed in a sexual scandal. Do you remember that? Where he was
Yeah.
accused of miscreant sexual activity. Oh, if
Yeah.
that didn't,
He took his wife to a sex club
exactly.
as if that's some kind of sin. Yeah.
Exactly. So this guy falls out. They bring in some guy that they know Obama can beat easily, who I knew him. He was crazy as hell. And boom, Obama, he couldn't lose. He runs, and mysteriously, his opposite, the guy he was running against, who had been an incumbent for many terms, suddenly gets involved in a sex scandal. He's out of the
Yeah.
way. There's Obama. He's there for a year. Boom, he's president.
Yeah.
So that.
And he had a terrible record because I researched his background because I wrote a book, Obama's Unending War, and I got in touch with some people who knew him at Harvard and also in Illinois politics, and they really disdained him. Neither are African Americans, and like at Harvard, they nicknamed him Alabama because he totally sold out, the black student groups, and he struck this deal to become head of the Harvard Law Review, but that he would exclude other African Americans from the board and exclude a leftist viewpoint. And they really hated him. And then the same in Illinois politics, he repeatedly sold out the interests of the people in the community he was supposed to serve. And he even got in unethically. There was a woman who was generally beloved in that community and who was serving in the state legislature. And she even baked cakes for people. And she really stood up for the interests of the community. And then she was going to make a run for Congress, but she decided not to. So she was going to renew her seat. But then Obama's team, but she was late. Like she had to get the signatures at the last minute. So Obama's team, in a dirty way, combed through her signatures and found that one or two maybe were not signed properly. So they had her excluded so he could take the seat from her. And then he just sold out the people throughout his time in that position, and he did nothing. Like he was known for playing basketball, and just like an activist tried to get a meeting with him, he was too busy. But he would give favors for people like who wanted a license for a casino or something. He was that kind of state legislature. Like he didn't help the people who were fighting the good fight. He wouldn't even see them, and he did favors for seedy people. And that's the kind of guy he was, sadly.
Yeah, yeah. So exactly the kind of president he was
Yeah.
exactly kind of
And
state
that's what we
senator.
sadly get in politics when these big money interests, the CIA and mafia take control. You get these sleazeballs who rise to the top, and that's sad.
Exactly, and you have to suspect time and again. Come on, you see the connections between these people and the intelligence community, and you say to yourself, man, and the way the road is always plowed for them. You know what I mean? They want to
Yeah,
run for this. There's always a snow plow. Whoever's in the
yeah,
way, they didn't sign something right. They were involved in a sexual kind of deviant
yeah.
activity. There's always something.
And
Maybe
all
they're
their friends get sent to prison. Clinton's friends, the McDougal and the Whitewater, and of course he sold them under the bus. They all went to prison for life, and McDougal died in prison. Obama's friend went to prison. Tony Resko, Rod Blagojevich. He was doing the exact same thing, but somehow he made it to the White House, and they got 10, 15-year jail sentences. He had some very powerful people in his
ex-
corner. And that's like Netanyahu, as we were discussing. He belonged in prison a long time ago.
amazing. Well, thanks a lot. I always tell people, I look and we get 5, 6, 7, 8,000 views, and I always say, this probably is one of my favorites. This is one of my favorite segments of the week. And man, if there's one that should be getting a million views, this should be it. Something I do want to talk to you about, and that is, a good bit about some of the other presidents that were rubbed out that died mysteriously in office. Anyway, but I'm sure by next week we'll have plenty to talk about. And I'm
Yeah.
going to look around on your site. Everybody go to, and this is critical. Let me find it because I want to make sure everybody can see it. CovertAction magazine. This is a resource that a lot of people do not know about, and it is a critical resource. And I'm going to make it big here. If you look at this, let me give you an example. Look at some of the series that are available. 9/11. What do you need to know about 9/11? They got about a series, Israel-Gaza
Yeah, we have
war.
one on political assassination. I'm trying to turn that into a book. So, but a lot of the articles are there. So if you're interested in that dark side of American politics, we have a lot of articles. A lot of them I did on that I hope to put in my book. So
There we go. J. Edgar Hoover coordinated assassination of Martin Luther King, and James Earl Ray was a patsy. On, and look at this. Did Western forces try to assassinate Slovakia's Prime Minister Fico? I mean, there's so much stuff here that you can see. Another series. Let's look at the 9/11 real quick. Saudi networks. George W. Bush authorized the shoot down of hijacked planes on 9/11, but only after 3 planes had already crashed. Why did key U.S. officials protect the alleged 9/11 plotters? Anthrax attack. That's another good one, directed against public officials following 9/11, had all the markings of a false flag. That anthrax attack, when I found out that the anthrax had come from Fort Detrick. And then there was like Dr. something other. They're like, yes, it came from Fort Detrick. And here's the name of the guy who was involved. I'm like, oh, bro, well, I can't wait till they find out what he has to say. Oh, he committed suicide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So bottom line is you got lots of great stuff there. Tremendous amount of series. So those are some of my favorites. I think the war in Ukraine, I'm sure that's going to be good. There's a lot of good stuff there. So you can spend everybody, CovertActionMagazine.com. You can spend a lot of time there and really, really enjoy it. So, go over there. Can they become members or subscribe or something like that?
Yeah, we would appreciate your financial support because it's hard to. So for $25 a year, you can become a subscriber, and that helps keep us in business. Or if you have the means to become a yearly donor, it's a tax exempt donation. So please help us out because it's very difficult in this landscape for independent journalism.
There you go, right there. You can subscribe. I always recommend people, I ask people if you can afford it to, Patreon or buy me a coffee or whatever for this channel. But I always recommend my guests too, because what people don't understand is we're all out here doing it because we love it, we enjoy it. This is what we believe in. We feel that people need to be enlightened, but this stuff isn't free. It costs a lot of money to do this stuff, and most of the stuff you're giving of your time, but even the mechanics of being able to keep a website up and pay all the fees you need to pay and things like that are expensive. So we certainly appreciate it. CovertActionMagazine.com is important. Thanks a lot. Put a link in the chat. There we go. I'll put a link in the chat. That's a good idea. See, we will put a link in the chat. How's that? There we go. There's a link in the chat for CovertActionMagazine.com. Thanks a lot. Actually, that's a pretty easy one, but what the heck? We'll put the link in there anyway. Thanks a lot, Jeremy, and look forward to talking to you. Hey, everyone, we will both be, let's see, you can't be here next Friday.
Yeah, I'll be at a conference in Texas Tech University for the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm actually next Friday, come to think of it, I will be here. The following week, I'm going away. But at any rate, we'll be back in a couple of weeks, so we'll talk. All right, talk to you soon. And even when I'm away, I may be able, I may very well still be, I'm going to do shows while I'm away.
Okay, that's
so
Friday. I'm free, so.
Okay, I should be able to do it anyway. We'll be in touch and have fun at Texas Tech. Thanks a lot, everybody. Share this on all your social media platforms. We're out. Oops, I almost clicked on the wrong thing.